Hello, everyone. Just welcoming, waiting a couple minutes while everyone trickles in. While you're coming on in, please feel free to let us know in the chat where you're watching from. We always like to get a sense of where people are tuning in from. Just give it a couple minutes so everyone filters in. See places popping up already. It's great. We have Columbia, Maryland, New York City, Maine. So we're hitting a bunch of different places already. Santa Fe.
Wow.
It's great. Got some Connecticut. Well, welcome. As people come in, I'm going to get going, but continue to tell us where you're tuning in from as we get started here. So welcome to the Mark Twain House's Trouble Begins with Jason Silverman for his lecture on connections between Twain and Lincoln. I am Mallory Howard, the assistant curator here at the museum, and we are so excited to host you this evening for this virtual event. So thank you very much for joining us today from your own homes. As a reminder, a replay of this event will be made available on the Trouble Begins YouTube channel, accessible through our website. So you can always go back and watch it again. At the end of the program, we'll take a few minutes to do a question and answer from the audience. So throughout the event tonight, please, if you have a question, you'll notice a Q&A function at the bottom of your screen. So please submit all of your questions in there. It'll be a lot easier for us to find it and ask questions. So just put them in there whenever one pops into your head. So before we get started tonight, I'd also like to thank our sponsors for the 2024 Trouble Begins season, Kathleen and David Jimenez. So now let us introduce our guest for this evening. Jason Silverman is the Ellison Capers Palmer Jr. Professor of History Emeritus at Winthrop University, where he taught for over 33 years. Prior to that, he taught at Yale University for 4 years. Author or editor of 11 books, several of which were nominated for National Book Awards. His recent works are Abraham Lincoln the Athlete, a proud competitor, but a humble sportsman. When America Welcomed Immigrants, the short and tortured history of Abraham Lincoln's act to encourage immigration, and Lincoln and the Immigrant. The latter was awarded the Immigrant Civil War Award. So let's get started. I want to welcome Jason, and thankfully for you guys, we got all of our fawning over Lincoln over with prior to going live. So I'm now comfortable with handing it over to him so he can enlighten all of you as well. So Jason, thank you so much for doing this, and I'll hand it over to you.
Thank you, Mallory. First, I would very much like to thank Mallory and Jody for the invitation to speak in this prestigious lecture series, because in the interest of full disclosure, I am not a Mark Twain scholar. I'm not. For 40 years, I researched, wrote, and taught about Abraham Lincoln. So it's sort of a daunting task. I've never stepped over the disciplinary line into some of my friends in the English department, their territory, and I hope that I do them all a proud, like a proud papa, because Lincoln and Twain are two of a kind, and you're going to see that tonight, I hope. But the thing is, first, I wanted to share with every audience how I became a Lincoln scholar, because it's somewhat of a misnomer to say that 40 years of studying Lincoln, writing Lincoln. I've been a Lincoln fan since 4th grade. How, you might ask? Well, we had in 4th grade a series of historical vignettes for parent night. Now, I will confess that in 4th grade, I was not terribly familiar with Abraham Lincoln, but I thought it would really be cool to wear that top hat and have a fake beard. So I had volunteered for that part in our family vignette. My 4th grade teacher disavowed me of that very, very quickly in front of the entire class by saying, "You can't be Abraham Lincoln. You're not tall enough. You could be Stephen Douglas," which of course was the kiss of death as far as I was concerned, because I believed in all that I held sacred, that I would never be denied Abraham Lincoln again. And that set me on a path of studying about Abraham Lincoln that leads me to the present. But that doesn't really explain how in the world I sort of stepped in and on Mark Twain territory. A book that I did a couple years ago, I think, had to do with Abraham Lincoln and the railroad. And I came across something. Obviously, one of the chapters was about Lincoln and being a railroad lawyer, because in the 1850s, he was a very prominent corporate lawyer who made a lot of money. There's no doubt about that. One of his, I guess, most famous cases is something called the Effie Afton case. That is the name of a steamboat that broke, it crashed into and broke the Rock Island Bridge. Lincoln was defending the railroads. But I came across this, which really sort of intrigued me, and it sort of was the incentive for what you'll be hearing tonight. This is a letter that young Samuel Clemens wrote to Ann Taylor on May 25th, 1856. Now, Ann Taylor was one of the early infatuations of Mark Twain. This is what he wrote in his letter to Ann. "Yes, the loss of that bridge," meaning the Rock Island Bridge, "almost finished my earthly career. There is a slight nausea about my stomach, for certain malicious persons say that my heart lies in that vicinity. Whenever I think of the crash, I become nauseous, and I believe I should have evaporated and vanished away like a blue cloud if John, indefatigable, unconquerable John, had not recovered from his illness to relieve me of a portion of my troubles." That got me thinking. Lincoln's famous case, the Effie Afton, and all of a sudden on the boat that crashed is none other than young Samuel Clemens. And I thought, my Lord, what are the other connections between the two? And so that's what I would like to talk about tonight, are the things that I have found in the course of my research. And to be honest, this is sort of a general overview, in large part because there is a lot more material that I have that will be in a book on this subject about the historical connections between Mark Twain and Abraham Lincoln. So we begin with Mark Twain's very close friend, William Dean Howells, who was a youth from Ohio, had written Abraham Lincoln's campaign biography in 1860. Howells bracketed Twain and Lincoln together, calling the humorist the soul, the incomparable, the Lincoln of our literature, the very marrow of Americanism. It is a useful comparison, that of Lincoln from the prairies of Indiana and Illinois, and Mark Twain from beside the rolling Mississippi, each a child of the frontier, where the pulse of the democracy beat strongest, each inheriting some of the laughter and melancholy of lonely places and backwoods settlements, both mainly self-educated, fiercely honest in the logic of their conclusions, and both stamped unforgettably with the American brand. No land but the United States, no region except the West in the 19th century could have bred Abraham Lincoln and Samuel Clemens. In politics and letters, America does continue to produce men, and a few great ones, but the mold in which these two men were cast has long been broken. And now, generations after the statesman from Illinois and the Missouri humorist, both have become legends, and no names are perhaps as recognizable to so many average Americans as that of Abraham Lincoln and Mark Twain. Some comparison of these men, Lincoln and Mark Twain, their environment, their appearance, and their role in a life in a mixture of resemblance and differences helps recall certain forces at work in 19th century America. More sharply, their philosophies of life, what they thought about the goodness or badness of human nature, opens a debate that troubled many thoughtful citizens of the century, and judging by today's news stories, will never be settled to anyone or everyone's satisfaction. Of course, they never met. Lincoln was a Springfield lawyer when young Clemens was learning to pilot a steamboat on the Mississippi. Lincoln was in the White House when the wild-haired young Missourian joined the Confederate Army, served 2 weeks, and deserted to come out west. And so, he used to add, the Confederacy fell. Long before the young prospector and newspaper man, now writing under the river pilot's name of Mark Twain, returned to bask in the new fame won by his story of the jumping frog, Lincoln was already dead. But if these men, separated by space and the seniority of 26 years, had ever met, it is safe to assume they would have spoken much the same language. At a casual meeting, they would have enjoyed each other's stories and had been stirred to mirth by many of the same things. Under deeper acquaintance, they might have been drawn together by memories of a childhood that each prized, despite its material hardships, or have seen in each other's secret nature a sense of the poetry and the inscrutable mystery of life. Yet in their final verdict upon the race of man, they might have grown aware of an antagonism, at least between the Lincoln of 1864 and the Mark Twain of 1910 in the last year of each man's life. Lincoln's boyhood of privation, restlessness, and resourcefulness fell into a pattern that Twain would have recognized. From his own ne'er-do-well family, his dreams beside the river flowing through a wilderness, the feel of knife and oar in his calloused hands, his love of forest law and tenderness toward animals, and his instinctive loathing of cruelty and injustice of every form. Some passages in young Lincoln's life read like a chapter about Mark Twain's greatest creation, Huckleberry Finn. Huckleberry Finn, whether one remembers the shiftless and overbearing father, his influence tempered by the kindness of womenfolk, or a boy's set for practical jokes, such as the yarn that Lincoln did by holding a young boy upside down to leave muddy tracks on the ceiling, and then of cleaning them off after his stepmother, mystified at first how somebody was walking on the ceiling, had enjoyed a good laugh. Schooled in self-reliance, the pioneer boy, the young Clemens of Hannibal, very early on felt the drive of ambition. My best friend, Lincoln once said, is the man who will get me a book I ain't read. Surely by the meager standards of his community, whether in Indiana or in Sangamon County, Illinois, Lincoln had a vast appetite for books, biography, history, poetry, surveying, law. In those days, such a passion was less typical of the prairies than of New England, land of self-help and the printing presses. Later, Lincoln was to call the printing shop, Mark Twain's own apprenticeship, the Poor Boys' College. No doubt Lincoln's preference for using his mind over his body seemed very strange to his less ambitious father and neighbors. The sympathetic Dennis Hanks, Lincoln's cousin, admitted that Abe "'twas lazy, a very lazy man. He was always a reading, a scribbling, ciphering, writing poetry. It was not a trait unknown to Tom Sawyer, or for that matter to Clemens himself, for in the stress of pioneer and farm youth lay the inspiration towards labor-saving devices. Yet Lincoln was undoubtedly a boy and a man of great strength, who could lift 600 pounds, chop sugar trees and sycamores like 3 men at work, and sink an axe into hardwood deeper than any man thereabouts. In deference to Lincoln, as a kind of first draft of Paul Bunyan, the lumberjack hero, the Civil War humorist Robert Henry Newell, writing under the pseudonym Orpheus C. Kerr, would later report that when Abe was an infant of 16, he split so many rails that his whole country looked like a wholesale lumber yard. Moving to New Salem, young Lincoln out-wrestled the local strongman Jack Armstrong and became the idol of a good-natured gang of rowdies called the Clary Grove Boys, whose companionship Tom Sawyer and Huck Finn would certainly have prized. It was through manual skill and the coordination of eye and nerve that the frontier first granted its recognition, sensing none of the deeper gifts that lay within Lincoln, the athlete, and Clemens, the Crack River pilot. Lincoln's brief record in the Black Hawk War of 1832, like Clemens' campaign of 2 weeks in 1861, served the ends of humor rather than glory, though Clemens' sport with himself, unlike Lincoln's satire of shedding blood during the Black Hawk War because of mosquitoes, was probably a rueful form of self-justification for his desertion. To each, humor was life's great solution, and thereby hung a paradox. For in the temperament of both Lincoln and Mark Twain ran a deep vein of loneliness, reflectiveness, and melancholy. Beneath the hopefulness, exuberant exaggerations, and horseplay of the frontier lay the darker pools of pessimism and moodiness. From Lincoln repeating his favorite poem by William Knox, "Oh, why should the spirit of mortal be proud?" to Mark Twain in old age, singing in the moonlight from the spiritual "Nobody knows the trouble I've seen," runs the same thread of emotion. Even now, in Lincoln's storekeeping days at New Salem, he appears to be a sad, lonely man capable of making others laugh, until people came just to hear his jokes and found that after an evening of laughter, their rheumatism was better. In his humor, as in Mark Twain's, there was something therapeutic. After a second try, Lincoln won a seat in the Illinois legislature. Beginning to be moderately successful in law and politics, he moved to Springfield, and there in 1842, he married Miss Mary Todd, daughter of a well-to-do and respectable family. In social implication, it was not unlike Mark Twain's marriage to Olivia Langdon, daughter of the richest man in Elmira, New York, who similarly tried to civilize and conventionalize her husband. Probably Mark Twain's union was a happier one than Lincoln's. It is hard to forget Lincoln's reported answer to a small boy who asked him where he was going on his wedding morning. "To hell, I reckon," Lincoln replied. I wouldn't recommend saying that to anybody right now, but Lincoln did. Mrs. Lincoln, with her fetish of nice people and her code of etiquette books, tried to break her husband of eating in his shirt sleeves, using his own knife in the butter, or greeting lady callers in the parlor with the cheerful words, "She'll be down as soon as she gets on her trotting harness." On the other side of the picture, there is Lincoln, seen lunching at his office, alone on crackers and cheese, daring to ask a few of his friends to his home, but bearing with patience and often a touch of whimsical irony his wife's tantrums. Similarly, about Clemens's marriage into the provincial aristocracy of Elmira to a girl whose face, in a miniature carried by her brother, Mark Twain had first seen as an innocent abroad in 1868, much has been said. Van Wyck Brooks had written a book about it called The Ordeal of Mark Twain, in which he tried to prove that Clemens's match with this conventionally minded lady and his friendship with her genteel set virtually wrecked the artist within. Twain might, Brooks thinks, have become a true Renaissance man, but instead he became the crony of William Dean's Howells and Joseph Hopkins Twitchell. That Mark Twain loved his wife more romantically and gallantly than Lincoln loved Mary Todd at Beecher Stowe was sacred. After her death, apropos of a letter of his that she had pressed between the pages of her Bible, Mark Twain wrote a friend, "You know how it must humiliate a man in his unworthiness to have anything of his so consecrated. She hallowed what she touched far beyond the priest." Submitted with good-natured grumbling and a rare streak of boyish rebellion to her censorship of his work. I have written scarcely anything in 25 years that she hasn't edited or censored, Twain admitted. Yet in so many ways, she was Mark Twain's devoted partner, as well as his censor, inspiring and protecting him, soothing the minor irritations that might have sapped his full-blooded energy. It is clear, however, that she no more understood the deeper significance of his work than Mrs. Lincoln did of the wartime president. These men, who seem crude and awkward to some observers, so undiscerning that they fail to see the exquisite tact, the artist's temperament, the rare powers of perception and expression that lay within the nature of each. Since Nathaniel Stevenson's biography of Abraham Lincoln in 1922, Lincoln had been more widely recognized as a great artist who worked in the medium of public affairs, who voiced the hopes and decisions of a nation at its darkest hour in words of imperishable beauty. Mark Twain's medium was humor and satire, yet his most durable works are not buffoonery that first gained public notice, but the higher artistry, the poetry of books like Life on the Mississippi and Huckleberry Finn, which reflected the nostalgia of a whole nation for its youth. As for qualities of mind, Lincoln's thinking process was no brilliant flash in the pan. It was rather the long-headed horse sense that Americans traditionally prize. He compared his mind to a piece of steel. This is Lincoln describing his mind now. Very hard to scratch anything on it, and almost impossible after you get it there to rub it out. It was also a mind rich in American inventiveness. In earlier days, trying to make a steam plow, inventing a riverboat with expansible, buoyant chambers to lift it off the sandbars. And in the war years, passing from dissection of Tad, his youngest son, mechanical toys, to a study of new patents in canon. One can humorously recall that hapless inventor who submitted to Lincoln his plans for an ironclad ram, but who had forgotten to provide space in his design for fuel, at which point the president asked him if he intended the vessel to be driven by the force of circumstances. Lincoln's career, of course, deflected this frontier wit away from mechanics into law and politics. He learned to move stubborn men instead of stranded boats. Mark Twain had a similar suppressed urge to invent, with his interest in a steam generator, a steam pulley, a new method of marine telegraphy, an engraving process, the Page typesetting machine whose failure cost him a small fortune, a carpet pattern machine, and a spiral hat pin. And yet, with all their practicality, both Lincoln and Twain, children of the wilderness and the prairie, had a strong mystical streak. Dreaming dreams that foretold, speculating about the mystery of luck or fate, glancing at spiritualism, foreseeing things to come, whether young Clemens' forewarning of his brother's death in a steamboat explosion in 1858, or Lincoln's famous dream, moving ship with great rapidity toward a dark and infinite shore. He had this dream repeatedly, which he shared with his secretaries. But neither let those curious intuitions interfere with duty. The work at hand was primary. Both naturally belong to the tradition of the cracker-box humorist, droll, shrewd, driving home the point with, "That reminds me of a story." Their favorite yarns belong to the spirit of the frontier, bordering on exaggeration, horseplay, belly laughter. The laughter of President Lincoln was as healthy and healing as he needed it to be. His laughter helped to keep up the morale, even in the darkest days of the Civil War. It was often turned against him, as did Twain's on many occasions. Such laughter, however, was purifying, reassuring, reaffirming. In Twain's writing, The Mysterious Stranger, the celestial visitor says to the young boy, "For your race, in its poverty, has unquestionably one really effective weapon, and that's laughter. Power, money, persuasion, supplication, persecution, these can lift the colossal humbug, push it a little, weaken it a little, century by century. But only laughter can blow it to rags and atoms at a blast. Against the assault of laughter, nothing can stand." Even so, for Mark Twain as for Lincoln, humor had its tender aspect, and the sources of laughter and tears were quite close together. With Lincoln, the legendary man of sorrows, from whom, as his secretary said, melancholy dripped as he walked, might be compared to Mark Twain, who once said, "Everything human is pathetic. The secret source of humor is not joy, but sorrow." In the very aspect of both men, self-made and distinctive, there was an intangible of leadership, even drama. After Lincoln had begun to gain fame as one of the shrewdest lawyers on the Eighth Circuit in Illinois, riding in his rickety buggy from one county courthouse to another, swapping stories in taverns, chatting with farmers in their dusty barns and under the blazing sun, his legend preceded him. He grew into a great local character who, from his height and bony angularity, came to be recognized by strangers traveling the Illinois Central Railroad. Characterized by his dress coat with sleeves too short for his lean wrists, his gray woolen shawl in lieu of an overcoat, his faded cotton umbrella tied with a string to keep it shut, his homely, sorrowful face, sometimes lit with mirth, and his shrill, high-pitched voice. This was Mr. Lincoln of Springfield. His image could not have been improved, whether for caricature or immortality. No other land could have borne him any more than it could have bred Mark Twain, with his shock of fierce red hair that the years turned white, the hawk nose and hawk eye, keen and humorous, set among the wrinkles of sun and wind, brought on by the river and the flats of the West. From his first appearance on any platform, Mark Twain was an unforgettable, dramatic figure, more obviously self-conscious than Lincoln and more attentive to applause. Later, he began to dress all in white, a decision he made characteristically by ordering 14 white suits, 7 to wear through the week, while 7 were at the cleaners. As an old man, still recalling his youth, his homesickness for a boy's paradise, and the large freedom of the frontier, in his white clothes, he seemed like some benign ghost revisiting the past. Unlike Lincoln, he loved the spectacle of appearances. At home, he startled guests at his mansion Stormfield by coming down for an evening in a flowered silk dressing gown. His comment on his doctorate of letters from Oxford University, "I like the degree well enough, but I'm crazy about the clothes," and of how, in lack of another opportunity, he wore the hood and gown at the wedding of his daughter Clara. All of this is quite revealing. Unlike Lincoln, he had the passion of the far Westerner, gold miner, and cowboy for dressing up. In dress, as in so many other ways, he played the individualist, where Lincoln was the Democrat. Both, of course, had come from frontier democracy, where the concept of equality seemed more real than in the cities, and the, quote, axe and rifle made all men equally tall. Both Lincoln and Twain possessed an intuitive sympathy and championship for the underdog, an abhorrence of bullying and injustice. Long before professional historians went to work on him, Mr. Lincoln of Springfield was known as the friend of the average person and a neighbor to rely on. Later, to a nation at war, the very name of Father Abraham seemed to promise hope, rest, and tender compassion. Mark Twain never underwent the ordeal by fire of Abraham Lincoln, was never called to serve his country with the wisdom and self-effacing patience of the man from Illinois. But by origin and conviction, he was a passionate egalitarian and a good-hearted man. No brute ever does a cruel thing. That is the monopoly of those with the moral sense, Twain once wrote bitterly. He hated bullies, dictators, and the cruelties that sprang from the overmastering power. His Connecticut Yankee says the cruel laws are not possible in a democracy, and this, at least, is what Clemens wanted to believe. In comparison with Lincoln, quote, the friend of the black man, unquote, one might set apart Mark Twain, whose understanding of the African American, his racial virtues, and charm, along with his frailties, was so vivid. His revolt against the African Americans' dehumanizing by Twain's own fellow townsmen can be seen when Huck Finn tells Aunt Sally about the steamboat explosion. "Good gracious," she said, "anybody hurt?" "No, killed a N-word." "Well, it's lucky," she said, "because sometimes people do get hurt," unquote. It is this same Huck Finn who, with the Calvinist fear of brimstone in his blood, is tempted to write Miss Watson, legal owner of the slave Jim, to report the fugitive's whereabouts. Then Huck's innate decency and mercy rise to smite him. Huck says, "It was a close place. I took the letter up and held it in my hands. I was a trembling because I got to decide forever betwixt two things, and I knowed it. I studied for a minute, sort of holding my breath, then says to myself, all right then, I'll go to hell, and tore it up. It was awful thoughts and awful words, but they was said, and I let them stay said and never thought no more about reforming." It is important to mention that Mark Twain paid the way of an African-American student through Yale as what he called his, quote, part of the reparation due from every white to every black man. Mrs. Clemens once remarked to her husband that he might save himself a lot of time and trouble, quote, if he would only consider every man colored until he was proven white, unquote. While rejecting the orthodox theology, as Lincoln did also, Mark Twain accepted the Christian ethics, saying that all Americans have the moral constitution of Christians. His sense of charity went along with a strict sense of honesty. Like Honest Abe of so many stories, from shopkeeping days to the White House, Mark Twain had a stubborn core of personal honor. No incident in his life is better known than his refusal to take refuge in the bankruptcy laws when his publishing house failed, and his paying the creditors 100 cents on the dollar by undertaking a world lecture tour at a time when health and creative energies were already flagging. Like Lincoln, he was an incurable idealist and expected the same spirit in other people, though when disappointed, he turned bitter, while Lincoln remained unshaken. For in Mark Twain, the stuff of life was volatile. In Lincoln, it was patient and steadfast. Moreover, Mark Twain lacked Lincoln's core of the ultimate courage. Concerning the tyranny of public opinion, Twain once wrote, of course, with a touch of humor, "If I had lived at the beginning of things, I should have looked around the township to see what popular opinion thought of the murder of Abel before I openly condemned Cain. I should have had my private opinion, of course, but I shouldn't have expressed it until I felt the way," unquote. To him, loyalty to persons was much more real than loyalty to principles. Whether he was defending his friend Twitchell for following the dictates of his congregation, the church of the holy speculators, as Twain called it, in forsaking the liberalism of Grover Cleveland, or refusing to criticize Standard Oil because Henry H. Rogers had befriended him. Always more self-conscious than Lincoln, and lacking the latter's great depths of serene courage, Mark Twain was quite sensitive to public opinion and sought hungrily for approval. Like so many other great humorists and satirists, he seemed daring or even radical, while at heart he was conservative, most at ease when deriving novelty, experiment, and eccentricity, knowing all the while that at his back he had the great public and the conventional truths to back him up. His grasp of first principles in contrast to Lincoln's, was unsteady. And unlike Lincoln, he somewhat feared to walk alone. What other people thought mattered little to Lincoln. Abuse and hatred he bore without complaint, for malice awoke no echo in him. But Twain was ever explosive, nursing pet hates and feuds, as seen most clearly in Bernard De Voto's edition of posthumous papers called Mark Twain in Eruption. Lincoln was no volcano, but rather the solid sentinels to the far west, the Rocky Mountains that he so earnestly desired to see, but never did. A penultimate comparison and contrast now are important. In their attitudes toward their fellow humans, both men, with that shrewdness in sizing up motives characteristic of the frontier, or the horse trader, panhandler, and confidence man, had a curious bias toward realism, perhaps even cynicism. But in the way in which this worked in their respective lives is a study in difference. William Herndon, who was Abraham Lincoln's last law partner, remembered some of Lincoln's talk in their law office at Springfield. Mr. Lincoln knew very well that the great leading law of human nature was motives. He reasoned all notion of a disinterested action from my mind. I used to hold that an action could be pure, disinterested, and wholly as, well, as free as from all selfishness. But he struck all that faith out of me. His idea was that each, every, and all human actions was caused by a motive, and that at the bottom, that motive was self and selfishness. He defied me to act without motive. He defied me to act unselfishly. And when I did the act and told him what I did, he ridiculed all notion from my mind of its unselfishness, its purity, its holiness. Herndon goes on to say that Lincoln had an exalted idea and sense of right and equity, an intense love and worship of what was true and good. As for Lincoln, under the growing wisdom of years and the quicker reckoning of his responsibilities, as president, this casually expressed creed of skepticism was soon forgotten or overridden. It was perhaps just another attempt at thinking things for himself, which later was discarded like a problem in pure mathematics in favor of more urgent duties. The determination set in his bones, which led him to speculate this way, was buried under the stress of a great cause and a great war into a feeling that man's destiny was decreed not perhaps by his own blind selfishness, but a power greater than himself that made for righteousness. The experience of care and sorrow deepened Lincoln, giving him gravity, forbearance, and a wise tenderness. A personal loss like the death of his 11-year-old son, who many people said was the closest resemblance to Abraham Lincoln and who had the most in common with his father, and the vaster tragedy of American brother against brother, of the casualty lists over which one or two have heard him cry in the telegraph office, "My God," or "If there is a hell, then I am in it." The president who walked down rows, dozens and dozens of rows of hospital beds, and sat beside the dying until their last breath, and was overheard by the White House guard moaning in his sleep regularly, may have carved lines into his weary face, but they also enabled his heart, the religion of humanity, the faith in democracy, which he struggled to save in saving the Union, had long since become the man himself. Never an orthodox churchgoer, Lincoln in the war years did become increasingly to rely upon that source of all strength, which he called God. Only faith in God's wisdom behind the deadly design of war rendered such sacrifice bearable and enabled him as president to make it from day to day and make those terrible decisions upon which all depended. To one who had felt that Lincoln felt, seen what he had seen of heroism and suffering, the theory of self-interest as the mainstream of man's acts must have seemed shallow. Mark Twain, a reader of Irish historian, essayist, and political theorist William Edward Hartpole Lecky, and the 18th century freethinkers, who likewise had absorbed some of Jonathan Edwards' logic about the dominion of motive and necessity, long speculated in the same direction. His wicked book, which his wife kept him from publishing lest it do public harm, What is Man?, expresses the point of view recorded by Herndon. The sole impulse that ever moves a person to do a thing is the necessity of contexting his own spirit and winning its approval. In a lecture at the University of Chicago, Bernard De Voto said that Mark Twain, the lecture title was Mark Twain and the Symbols of Despair. Mark Twain developed a fatalistic philosophy, basing his conclusions in part upon a mass of then unpublished Twain manuscripts. He observes that in 1889, when Twain published The Connecticut Yankee, the humorist was at the height and powers of his good fortune. The backwoods boy, river pilot, tramp, printer, silver miner, and West Coast bohemian had followed the rising curve of success till he became rich, idolized, and world famous, with a devoted wife and 3 delightful children. Then adversity struck. His publishing firm went bankrupt, and the typesetting machine failed to the tune of $200,000. Mark Twain, to whom material comforts and luxuries always mattered as truly as they were unimportant to Lincoln, found himself bogged heavily in debt. Much worse was to come. His daughter Jean developed the symptoms of epilepsy that threw a shadow of dread forever upon their home. Mrs. Clemens fell into chronic invalidism, finally ended with death. The humorist's own robust physique began to fail. And while he was absent on the round-the-world lecture tour, he had the news that his eldest daughter had suddenly died of meningitis. A sensitive, temperamental man, he felt bitterly of all these blows of fortune, most especially the last. Furthermore, he began to see that his genius was leaving him and that his once magnificent creativity was ebbing. To the artist who had begun to use work as an opiate for grief, this was a tragic discovery. He still worked feverishly and despairingly, beginning stories that would not come out right and endlessly reworked and abandoned. Between the lines, said De Voto, one could read the question Twain kept asking himself, this child of fortune whom fate had suddenly stricken down. Was I to blame? Is all this a punishment for something I have done or left undone? And so throughout these unfinished and hopelessly complicated stories runs the thread of determinism and free will. The optimism of the West and the frontier so strong in the youthful Clemens was now heavily clouded with despair. He wonders if democracy, which hinges upon the free will of man in ordering his own life, can be anything but a mirage. Years before, in The Gilded Age, Twain had written satirically of Washington and the federal government in that tragic era that followed the death of Lincoln and Lincoln's idealism. Now, Twain saw nothing but despair. His favorite phrase came to be, that damned human race, unquote. But not until the end of his life, in the last chapter of The Mysterious Stranger, did Mark Twain fully articulate all of his disillusion. The chapter in which the supernatural visitor, calling himself Satan, tells the boy, who is sort of a medieval Huck Finn, it is true, that which I have revealed to you. There is no God, no universe, no human race, no earthly light, no human, no hell. It is all a dream, a grotesque and foolish dream. Nothing exists but you, and you are but a thought, a vagrant thought, a useless thought, a homeless thought, wandering forlorn among the empty eternities. And so, stating from the same premise, the self-centeredness of man, Lincoln and Mark Twain reached widely different conclusions under the weight of sorrow and the weight of this unintelligible world. On one hand, a sense of the higher loyalties to democracy and humanity with charity for all, and of a God whose will is our peace. On the other, certain embittered conclusions about that damned human race, and the feeling that life at its meanest is but cheap, at its noblest only a poet's illusion. With all the gifts of Mark Twain, his honesty, his contagious laughter, his manly determination to think squarely, he somehow shrinks in nature beside a fellow American whose adversity made him not cynical, but more deeply wise, and who is able to give strength and faith to millions of his countrymen. Today, we see how great a gift is this democracy, how Americans are willing yet to give up selfhood and life that others may be free. How supremely right was Lincoln in his convention that fearlessness for the right is a better thing than fearfulness for peace. The ultimate connection between these two men is something which I found incredibly amusing, and that's baseball. One doesn't know that Lincoln was a pretty good baseball player. He played something called town ball, and the stories about him are epic. Now, you got to keep in mind that anyone who studies Lincoln is suffering from a disadvantage from the outset, because Lincoln was, according to one of his cabinet members, the most damned tight-lipped, reticent human being I have ever met in my life. No diary, no journal, no really deep contribution to a biography. Lincoln would write little notes, put them in a drawer somewhere, and forget about them. But we do know from many of the accounts that people knew him that he played baseball and he enjoyed it. And he was a pretty good first baseman and a good hitter, according to the people who watched him. He brought his son to baseball games. He hosted baseball games on the White House lawn. He would come down occasionally, throw the ball around and get everybody excited. And in many ways, he was really and truly the first baseball president. There is no evidence that Mark Twain ever played baseball, but he was the part owner of a baseball team, and that is the Hartford Blues, or the Hartford Blue Stockings. He was asked on several occasions to umpire games and kind of refused to do that, again, weighing to whether or not it was in his interest to have the public hate him for being an umpire and making the wrong call. So I found this somewhat incredibly interesting that Lincoln, baseball player and baseball aficionado, and Twain, who wrote a great deal about baseball in a Connecticut Yankee, including positions and umpire and all sorts of commonalities with modern day baseball. These two guys had that as the ultimate connection that I have found. And I genuinely believe what I said at the very, very outset, that the mold was broken when these two guys were created. Thank you so very much for listening to me tonight and for giving me this wonderful opportunity to lecture to you.
Thank you so much. That was wonderful.
Thank you.
I hung on your every word because I love Lincoln and Twain so much. It's really fun to talk about them together. But I do want to jump in. There's several questions, so I do want to jump into those.
Okay.
So first question, did Lincoln and Twain ever meet? And if not, what might they have talked about if they did?
No, they never met. They never met. I mentioned that earlier in my talk. Lincoln was already in his career when Mark Twain was a young riverboat pilot. And so 26 years separating the two and separating them by space, it would have been very impractical. I have no doubt that what they would have talked about, however, is centering around humor. They I can just see both of them trying to outdo the other one with stories and using that expression. That reminds me of a story. I also think if I can juxtapose everything, the later Mark Twain, if he had met the later Abraham Lincoln, would have talked about Lincoln's Emancipation Proclamation and his dedication to freeing the slaves and ending the Civil War for freedom of 3.9 million people in the South. Twain became quite enamored with Lincoln towards the end of his life. And he wrote some editorials. On Lincoln's birthday in 1901, he gave a lecture in a fundraising event at Carnegie Hall that attended by hundreds of people. And Twain was on the podium. He had former Confederates. He had former Union. And in this speech, he gave Lincoln the credit for creating a world, at least attempting to create a world that would have enabled these guys who had fought against one another in the Civil War to appear for a common cause to raise money for Lincoln Memorial University.
Perfect. All right, next question. Hi, Jason. I'm interested in how Clemens and Lincoln compared when it came to their personalities and language when they were hanging out with the boys and not under their wives' scrutiny. Have you ever read Twain's 1601? He could really cut loose.
I am familiar with that, as a matter of fact. And it's interesting because so could Lincoln. Lincoln, and he's come under a lot of criticism lately in the last couple of years, which I think is grossly unfair. But Lincoln is a guy that rode the Eighth Circuit from courthouse to courthouse as a lawyer. And he was with a group of lawyers and judges that stayed together. Now, Lincoln wasn't much of a drinker at all. And so at night, when court was not in session, all of these guys would go to the bar, tavern, and they drink. And Lincoln had no shortage of what he called ribald stories. Now, these ribald stories are probably tame compared to some of the things that Mark Twain uttered when he let loose. But I do think Abraham Lincoln would not have been offended by anything that Twain said. And I doubt seriously if Twain would have been offended by anything Lincoln said. And I'm certain that both of their wives would have been offended by everything they said.
Probably right on that one. All right, moving on to the next question. Did Twain ever write about Lincoln? Is there any evidence that Lincoln read Twain?
No, to the best of my knowledge, I don't think Lincoln, I don't think I've seen any evidence that Lincoln read Twain. I think Twain's greatest hits, so to speak, came after Lincoln was dead. But being a voracious reader of all sorts of things, I have no doubt that had he lived, he would have been a tremendous fan of Mark Twain, in large part because I really do think that Lincoln would have seen a great deal of himself in Huck Finn. And while I can't prove it, I'm speculating rather strongly that Twain had Lincoln in mind when he wrote sort of a portrayal of Huck Finn and his personality. I think of the two, I think Twain was probably much more familiar with Lincoln and his personality. Obviously, Lincoln was not. Excuse me. Lincoln was not familiar with Twain, but I do know that Twain read many of Lincoln's speeches, particularly the speeches about emancipation, particularly the speeches about the abolition of slavery, let's say in the District of Columbia. These speeches that Lincoln had written that were delivered to Congress, and not delivered at Congress, but sent to Congress, which became part of the body of literature that Lincoln left. Twain read those. There's no doubt about that, and he was impressed and influenced by them, in large part because he looked around his world, and Twain's world is a world in which much of what Lincoln lived for was undone during Reconstruction. So he's very impressed with what Lincoln sought to do, and I genuinely believe that Twain probably knew in his heart of hearts that Lincoln was a man that anybody and everybody should aspire to be like in terms of personality, because of his courage, his honesty, his single-mindedness to devotion, his refusal to accept that slaves should remain slaves just to satisfy and to avoid a war. So I'm relatively confident that Twain had read many of Lincoln's greatest hits. But again, Lincoln never wrote a book. He never wrote his memoirs. I mean, he was assassinated very early into his second term, so who knows what would have happened. But I know for someone like me who have spent everybody around him, because he doesn't say much at all.
I know that Twain was a big fan of the Gettysburg Address.
Yes.
And I know that Twain and Lincoln were also big fans of Artemus Ward.
Yes.
So
yes.
that
yes.
also would seem to give the impression that Lincoln would have been a fan of Twain, since Twain kind of took inspiration from Artemus Ward.
Yes.
Was really the precursor.
No doubt in my mind he would have been a big fan of Twain.
Yeah.
None.
All right. Let's see. This is kind of similar. Did Mark Twain read Abraham Lincoln's writings? We talked a little bit about that. How did Lincoln's assassination affect his writing and worldview? What was Twain working on at the time Lincoln was shot?
That's a good question. I really don't know the answer to what he was working on in 1865, but I do know that Twain was not unaffected by Lincoln's assassination. I could see in his later talks, particularly this talk on Lincoln's birthday in 1901 in Carnegie Hall, I could see in the correspondence that went back and forth between Twain and the organizers of this giant event, and I could see in Twain's own talks that he's giving before this, that he's recognizing that the assassination of Abraham Lincoln cast this dark, dark shadow on the country. A dark shadow that I think at one point Twain even said, and I don't remember where he said it, that the shadow still remains over the country in the 1870s, 1880s, and he was correct. He really was. I think I don't know for certain, but if Twain had started if Mark Twain had started either Tom Sawyer or Huckleberry Finn in 1865, I think even that might have perhaps shed a little light on how he cast Huckleberry Finn and Tom Sawyer, in terms of the quote that I read in Huck tearing up the letter that he was going to send to the owner of Jim.
Yeah, he was right after the Lincoln, or I guess that year, he would have spent most of his time out in the Nevada territory, of which Roughing It eventually comes from that. And then, yes, he was in California with Jumping Frog. So that's kind of where he was during that period. Someone wants to know, tell us about that Lincoln flag behind you, the Lincoln AIDS.
I stumbled upon that quite serendipitously. The Lincoln Abes were a Class D, which is not great, minor league baseball team in Lincoln, Illinois from 1910 to 1914. Now, why would I be interested in that? Well, I just finished a book, which will come out this summer, as a matter of fact, on the Lincoln Giants. The Lincoln Giants started in Lincoln, Nebraska, and they ended in Harlem, New York. And they were a pretty prominent team in the Negro leagues of the late 19th, early 20th century. And they had some pretty fantastic players, and they had a great season, or great seasons, I should say. So having written this book about the Lincoln Giants, and getting really excited about this, when I came across the Lincoln Abes, I thought, damn, I could do it again. The problem is that the Lincoln Abes were not nearly as good as the Lincoln Giants. And there isn't as much material on the Lincoln Abes as there were on the Giants. So I haven't given up hope that I'll ever be able to write that book, but hope is fading rapidly, because I just don't think that book is doable. But like I said, I got really excited with another team named for Lincoln. See, Mallory, I told you I'm a Lincoln nerd. There's no doubt about it, even in baseball.
I love it. Next question. I don't think we'll get to all these, but we'll take a few more if you don't mind.
I don't mind.
What inspired you to talk about and write a book about these two great men?
Well, I think I have prided myself, at least on my last 5 books, but pretty much throughout my whole career, I prided myself on choosing topics that had not been done, because the Library of Congress estimates that there's about 16,000 books on Lincoln. And at one point, they predicted that a book on Lincoln came out every 5.5 days. So the last 5 books have been about Lincoln the immigrant, Lincoln the athlete, Lincoln and the railroads, and Lincoln's act to encourage immigration. So when I was doing the railroad book, and I'd come across that Mark Twain was on Samuel Clemens was on the Effie Afton, the riverboat that crashed into the Rock Island Bridge, I thought, wow, this is wild. Has anybody ever connected the two? And that's what inspired me to find out. And believe it or not, when I started, I thought, you know what? This is going to be like the Lincoln Abes. That's what this is going to be. I'm going to run out of stuff. Well, no. As I mentioned to you before we even began, if I had used everything that I put together to put in this book about Lincoln and Twain, we'd be talking for 2 days. If I could, if my voice held out.
Okay, next question. What motivated Lincoln's moral character and structure? How does it compare and relate to Mark Twain? What are some instances where it tied them both in their virtue, but differ in their execution?
Well, I think very early on, they were very similar in their outlook about their philosophy of morality, let's say. But I think one major difference between the two of them is the desire by Mark Twain to be accepted, and the lack of that by Abraham Lincoln. Lincoln did what he thought had to be done. It was against the advice of usually his entire cabinet. And here's a guy who is president of the United States, and he has all of these cabinet members who want to be president, who are undermining him every step along the way, until Lincoln took command. Lincoln took command and in his own inimitable way said, this is the way it's going to be. I think Mark Twain had a strong moral fiber to him as well. But I really think that was compromised somewhat by Mark Twain's concern about public opinion. Lincoln didn't care about public opinion. But you got to also keep in mind that in some ways it's apples to oranges, because Mark Twain was never tested by the ordeal of fire. Never. He lived a relatively simple and positive life until all of those tragedies befell him that I spoke about in the talk. The only thing I could say is, who knows what Twain would have done if he had faced the same kind of unbearable pressure that Lincoln had facing a war that they've upped the total now. So it used to be about 600,000. Now it's over 750,000 Americans dead at each other's hands during the Civil War. And mind you also that Mark Twain enlisted in the Confederate Army and lasted 2 weeks. So I don't think war was his forte. And but you know, one could say that Lincoln really didn't have a hell of a lot of experience in war either, in the Black Hawk War, because the only thing he wrote about it really was that any blood that was shed was because of mosquitoes. So I really think that to talk about Lincoln's character and morality and talk about Twain's character and morality, I think we have to be very careful given their times in which they lived and matured.
All right, next question. Did Twain and Whitman ever meet?
Wow. That I don't know.
I
do
don't
not know
believe
that.
they did. I know that Twain corresponded with him. I know that he read Whitman. He saw him speak, but I don't believe they actually ever met face to face, sadly.
Thank you.
Yes.
You got me out of that one.
Do you think that the friendship between Grant and Lincoln has similarities to the friendship between Clemens and Grant?
Yes. Yes, I do. Because I think the friendship for Lincoln, he had never heard of Grant until victories in the West. And Grant's opposition was trying to convince Abraham Lincoln that Grant was a coward, a drunkard, all of those sorts of things. So the friendship that developed between Grant and Lincoln, and again, mind you, you're talking about a man who dies in 1865, which is literally days after the surrender at Appomattox. Lincoln came to respect Grant and to respect his opinion. And he said things to his cabinet and to other military men that man fights. And if we can get the other generals to fight the way he does, then send them all a barrel of whiskey if Grant drinks whiskey. So that was built on respect. The Twain or Clemens, Twain, and Grant also built on respect, because as he's poor and as he's dying, Mark Twain rescues Twain's memoirs and publishes them so that, publishes Grant's memoirs so that Grant's voice is heard long after he dies about his view of the Civil War and the battles that he fought. So Twain would never have done that had he not respected the man who Grant was, respected what Grant did during the Civil War. 2 terms as president, you know, there's good and there's bad to what Grant did. Grant wasn't a dishonest man, but he surrounded himself with a whole bunch of dishonest people. So I don't know to what extent Mark Twain would have found the presidency of Ulysses Grant to be earth-shattering. But the man himself was sufficient enough in Mark Twain's esteem to be able to help him out and publish, which was a great success, his memoirs.
They were quite successful. Okay, I think we have time for one more. Twain and Lincoln were both animal lovers. Do you have anything to say on that subject? Thanks for the great talk.
There's no doubt. There's no doubt at all that they were both incredible animal lovers. The White House, some contemporaries described as a zoo, because Lincoln was a very indulgent father. And so it was not uncommon. I mean, Lincoln had a wonderful dog that he named Fido. And that dog was Lincoln's companion and friend. And it broke Lincoln's heart when he left Fido behind to go to Washington, D.C. to become president. There's a book entitled Lincoln and Fido, and it brought tears to my eyes as I was reading this because it was very touching. But he let his sons have goats in the White House, horses. Tad wanted to ride a horse in the White House. It drove Mary Todd nuts. It really did, because he was so indulgent. And he had a thing for cats. He simply could not say no to cats. Twain the same way. It brought out his humanity in his treatment of animals and pets. And he could not stand to see animals abused or ignored or mistreated. I think you can always tell a true great person by their love of animals. I really do. I really, truly do. And in that case, I think both of them pass every single conceivable test for love and compassion of their furry creatures.
Very well said. Yes, we at the Twain house know that Twain was especially a big cat lover. So most of us that work here have cats. And we always, of course, love their creative names for their cats, like Sin, Satan, Pestilence, Famine, Earthquake, Buffalo Bill, Abner. I mean, on and on. So very creative with the pet cat names. But Jason, I want to thank you so much. This was fascinating. I can't wait to hear more as you continue diving in to Lincoln and Twain. Thank you everyone for joining us tonight. And Jason, we'll keep in touch and hopefully talk more Twain and Lincoln in the future, because this was just wonderful and we really appreciate you joining us.
Well, I had a wonderful time, and I'd like to thank the audience for their great questions and for listening and for all of their comments. I've seen some of them as they've come up here in terms of enjoying the lecture. I want to thank Jody. And you, Mallory. You guys are wonderful. If all of their colleagues at the Mark Twain House and Museum are as wonderful as you, then this is an incredible place to go, and I'm going to come visit.
Oh, thank you. Well, we're looking forward to your visit. You have to come and see us, and we have to take you through the house, and we'll chat more about Lincoln.
You got it, girl. You got it.
Right.
Anytime you want to chat about Lincoln, you've got my telephone number and my email, day or night.
All right, it's going to happen. Well, with that being said, thank you all for joining us, and we'll see you next time.